Hello and welcome to the Indiana Solve Climate by 2030 webinar. My name is Sarah Mincy and I'm the director of the Integrated Program in the Environment, or IPE, at Indiana University Bloomington, and we're the host of this evening's event. As you know, we are tuned in across the state from our homes mostly, participating as college and high school students, faculty, community members, local government officials, environmental organizers and managers and business leaders. And we're all interested in the steps that we can each take to help move the needle to mitigate climate change in Indiana. And as we focus on Indiana, thousands of others are tuned in at this very moment across US states and territories and even other countries to think about their own communities. And that's because this event, this movement really, is organized on a national and international level by our colleague Eben Goodstein from Bard College. And Eben has a bit of an introductory video for us to set the stage for the webinar. And so I'm going to share that with you now. Let me share my screen with you.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact. The U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility-scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the U.S. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments. Starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians, government policies have brought these industries to scale. And now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
Hi again. Those were stirring remarks from Eben that set us up for a really thoughtful discussion this evening. Again, my name is Sarah and I will moderate the webinar. And as you may have seen in the communication about this webinar, we had planned for Senator Mike Braun to offer a welcome. Given the public health crisis our government leaders are facing, Senator Braun was unable to join us after all. However, he sends word that he's very interested in continuing to engage with us in solving climate in the weeks ahead. And so I hope we can soon define how he can do that. And as we do, we'll post more information to our website about that. I want to begin by thanking you for joining us today. Our goal is to help you develop greater motivation and understanding about how and where you can truly engage to quickly and efficiently take steps to help mitigate climate change in Indiana. We will do that tonight in 3 different parts. First, we will hear about how the climate is changing in Indiana, what are the state-specific contributions to climate change, and some high-level steps that we can take to mitigate these changes. And the director of the Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute, Janet McCabe, will speak to those points. Secondly, tonight, we're going to hear from IU Professor Shahzeen Attari about how we can fuse facts and feelings to motivate action on climate change. She's going to address the challenges of stabilizing carbon dioxide concentrations and then the deep adaptation necessary to limit our losses. Third, you're going to hear the story of Stephen, a former IU student turned city government official, and Vernice, a high school student from Fishers, Indiana, about how they have worked together to enact climate solutions at various levels of government, including working toward a climate resolution in the city of Fishers. And then finally, you're on, our webinar participants. We want you to engage throughout the webinar with your comments and questions. And I'm going to cut now to Steve, our technical producer, to pop on the screen and tell you how you can do that.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Steve, the tech guy. I'm helping to run the technology for today's webinar. And you can submit your written questions or comments at any time today by clicking on the Q&A button, which you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window. And you may need to hover your mouse over the Zoom window to make that little Q&A button appear. But anyway, we'll collect all your comments and questions as the webinar goes on today, and then address as many as we can live toward the end of the webinar. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Steve. Participants, we'd also like you to engage right now, actually, in a quick live poll. Steve, you can go ahead and launch the poll. It's going to pop up on your screen. There's a couple questions there for you about making change to solve climate, and we'd like you to complete those, and we'll have a look at the results of those a little bit later during the webinar. Many of you will also have a chance to engage with the Solve Climate 2030 movement through your classes and group discussions, as Eben was suggesting. We'd plan for those, of course, to be in person, but we'll have to make those online discussions now, and I hope they're productive. Also, you can stay engaged online with us by checking back on our website, environment.indiana.edu. We'll have a recording of the webinar posted there soon and links for you to further engage on this topic. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you our first speaker tonight, Janet McCabe. Janet is a professor of practice at the Indiana University McKinney School of Law and the director of IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. From 2009 to 2017, Janet worked in the US EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, including as acting assistant administrator during President Obama's second term. Prior to joining EPA, Janet was executive director of Improving Kids Environment, Inc., a children's environmental health advocacy organization based out of Indianapolis. And from 1993 to 2005, Janet held several leadership positions in the Indiana Department of Environmental Management's Office of Air Quality, and was the office's assistant commissioner from 98 to 2005. Before coming to Indiana in 1993, Janet served as Assistant Attorney General for Environmental Protection for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Assistant Secretary for Environmental Impact Review. And Janet graduated from Harvard College in 1980 and Harvard Law School in 1983. Janet, thanks for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing you talk.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. It's absolutely great to be here. There's just something special about knowing that people all across the country are tuning into their own state's webinar right at the same time and getting fired up, I hope, to think about the things that we can all do to try to address this terrible situation of climate change in the country. Because if there's one message that you get from today, it's that there are all things that we can do. And those of us on this webinar see that every day. I hope you are all keeping safe and healthy in this challenging time. Joining by Zoom from all across Indiana was actually our plan for this event. And now, of course, that seemed almost clairvoyant, sadly so. But we've all gotten very familiar with Zoom technology here in the last week or two. And I'm really looking forward to a productive discussion tonight, and particularly the questions and ideas that I hope that you will all put into the conversation, because this is a participatory activity. My presentation today will set the context for climate change in Indiana. And as Sarah said, I'm going to talk about three things. First, what is happening and what will be happening? What's predicted for the future in Indiana as a result of climate change? Second, how is Indiana contributing to greenhouse gas emissions that are fueling climate change? And how do we fit into the national context and global, in fact? Third, I'd like to start the discussion about solutions for Indiana. Every state, every country is different, both in terms of the sources of emissions that they put out, but also in their political climates, their cultures, and their opportunities for action. Solutions need to take into account all of these individual features to come up with a solution that is workable and actually can be enacted and can be implemented in any particular state. And those of us that have worked at the government level have a lot of firsthand experience about that, and I hope that many of you will have that in your future too, because it's a great way to contribute. I want to emphasize at the beginning of the discussion, before I start going through my slides, that what we're really talking about is the future of our communities. Solutions are important not just because of the dramatic and potentially devastating impacts that climate change will have in Indiana. The solutions that we talk about with respect to climate change have immediate impacts as well, positive impacts. They reduce air pollution. They provide local jobs and positive economic impacts for our communities. They improve public health and the quality of life in our communities. So I will probably say that a bunch more times during this presentation because that's what I say and it's true. All right, here we go. So I'm going to start by talking about climate change in Indiana. I could show you a lot of pictures that look like this from Indiana. This is from northern Indiana. It is the East Chicago High School football field, completely inundated. But there are other impacts that climate change is already having in Indiana. It affects much more than just floods. This is the Karner blue butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly that lives only in 2 places in the entire world, Northwest Indiana and Southeast Michigan. Except the climate is changing in Northwest Indiana, and we are starting to lose this beautiful Karner blue butterfly. Climate change is also bringing drought to Indiana. This is a map of where the drought was declared in 2012, which farmers still talk about as a very traumatic and troubling time. Last summer, a lot of the news was that the beaches on Lake Michigan were eroding because the lake levels are rising. Speaking of species, we're not just losing species, we are seeing armadillos in southern Indiana, mostly in the form of roadkill at the moment, but I just don't think of Indiana as a state where we have armadillos, but that is getting to be the case. So the fact is that Indiana is getting warmer. This chart shows measured historical temperature, annual average temperatures, and you can see that the trajectory is going up, and we've gone up 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century. That may not sound like much, but if you are a meteorologist, it is huge. And you have to keep in mind that these are expressed in averages. That doesn't account for how hot we all feel on a given day, or how hot the corn plant or the soybean plant or the Karner blue butterfly feels on a given day. Warmer temperatures overall mean that we have fewer days with frost, we have fewer cold days, we have fewer very cold days, and we have significantly more heat waves and warmer overnight temperatures. One of the things that I was really interested to learn not that long ago was how important it is for humans, animals, and plants that temperatures go down overnight. Indiana is also getting wetter and drier, and our storms are geting more intense. So this shows annual total precipitation, and you can see that's been going up and going up quite dramatically, especially in some parts of the state. But as I'll show you later in this presentation, the precipitation patterns are quite seasonal. So we're seeing most of this additional precipitation in the winter and early spring when the ground may be frozen. There are not plants in the ground to absorb all that water. That's one of the reasons that we're so prone to floods and water quality problems in the winter and spring. In the later summer, however, when the plants really need that water to bring them ready to harvest, we are seeing less rain. If you haven't seen the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, I strongly urge you to check it out. This is a series of reports put together by researchers from Indiana's universities, Purdue, IU, Notre Dame, and others. These are reports on different aspects of how climate change is going to impact Indiana. What I've talked about just now are the changes that we're already seeing, but these reports also show projections and how the increases in precipitation and temperature are going to affect Indiana in 2050, 2080, and the end of the century. So what does it tell us? It tells us that temperature is going to continue to go up. The researchers use a range of models that are used by climate modelers all over the world. And you can see that in a worst case scenario, the temperature could go up in Indiana by as much as 10 degrees by the end of the century. That is colossal temperature change. In a medium greenhouse gas scenario, the temperature can go up another 5.5 degrees. That is just slightly less than colossal in terms of the impact that it will have on our agriculture, our infrastructure, our industry, and its public health. The projections also show that precipitation and extreme precipitation is going to increase. And here in these charts, you can see how those increases are not distributed evenly throughout the year. So there is more of this to come, and you can see it gets more dramatic under the two scenarios. Okay, so what do these things mean in terms of implications for us? Well, hotter weather means more air pollution. It means longer allergy seasons. It means more heat waves. It means more people using their air conditioners, which not only means more emissions from our power plants, but it also means a higher electric bill for Hoosiers who run those air conditioners. It also means stress and strain on the power grid. And it means possibly trouble for our farmers or concern for our farmers with the crops. More extreme weather and floods means property damage, public safety concerns. It means more mold in our homes. And it also means trouble for the farmers. If you remember last spring, there was a significant delay in many farmers being able to plant their crops because their fields look like this. Not only can you not put the seeds in the ground, you can't get the heavy equipment into a field like that because it will get bogged down. So these two impacts, higher temperatures and more extreme precipitation, lead to a wealth of impacts. And these are just a few of the highlights. Okay, so how does Indiana contribute to climate change here in our country and around the world? This information comes from the Energy Information Administration, which collects information about energy use and production from states all around the country. And these are pretty simple slides, but this gives you a sense. First of all, it shows you that Indiana, yes, indeed, is a heavily industrial state. We all know that. States that are heavy in industry are going to use more energy. They just are. There's nothing wrong with being a heavy industrial state. States do different things, and we make a lot of things in Indiana. It means we'll use a lot of energy. But you can also see that transportation accounts for about a quarter of our energy use in this state. And then commercial and residential buildings also are significant users of energy. The thing about this chart is that all of these sectors provide tremendous opportunities to become cleaner and greener and more efficient. And we'll talk about that in 1 minute. The chart on the right, I'm sorry, all those colors aren't identified. But the other reason that Indiana, as they say, punches above its weight when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions is that the majority of our power comes from burning coal. Now, why is that? One of the reasons is because we have coal in Indiana, and it was a very important fuel source in Indiana and in many other states, and contributed hugely to this country becoming the modern country that it is, where everybody across the country has access to electricity, refrigeration, lights, and that sort of thing. But the fact is that fossil fuels like coal and natural gas are the ones that are contributing greenhouse gas emissions. Indiana used to be in the 90+% reliant on coal. We're now about 70%. What's making up most of the difference is the yellow down there, which is natural gas. Natural gas has seen a boom in recent years and has become extremely cheap and competitive with coal as a fuel source. The little blue slice at the top that I'm happy to see is getting larger, but not quickly enough, is renewable energy. Right now, we're at about 5% fueled by renewable energy, mostly wind, but also solar in Indiana. And those renewable sources are also becoming much more cost competitive with coal and with natural gas. That's why we're seeing such a boom. Indiana's contributions to climate change also come from our agriculture. According to EPA, agriculture accounts for about 9% of greenhouse gas emissions, and our friends, the cows, are big contributors to that, but also soil and manure management. Those are the three biggest sources of greenhouse gases, mostly methane, from the agricultural sector. Indiana is among the top 10 producers of most kinds of livestock, including cows. We have more than 1 million cows in the state. They contribute through something which in polite company is known as enteric fermentation, and in not so polite company is known as cow burps, or other emissive activities from cows. Either end, pick your end. So we do contribute in that way, but I also want to make sure that you know that our agriculture also provides tremendous opportunities for carbon sequestration in the soil, in the plants. And that's something that people are already starting to work on. So I want you to know about that. Just to wrap this up, Indiana is the 9th most energy intensive state per capita in the country, even though we are only the 17th largest in terms of population. So that makes us a big contributor when it comes to these emissions. Here's a couple of graphs that put Indiana in context with the rest of the country. This is kind of a busy but exciting slide that shows the top 10 greenhouse gas emitters on the left, and you can see Indiana there coming in as number 7. Well, how do we compare as Americans in terms of greenhouse gas emissions compared to the average global citizen? Well, we have a very electricity dependent lifestyle here in the United States. So one American is responsible for the equivalent of almost 3.5 average citizens in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. What does that look like for a Hoosier? Because of what I've just been telling you about, our heavy reliance on energy and carbon-based energy, one Hoosier emits about as much in a year as 6 average global citizens. We can be embarrassed about that, we can be ashamed about that, we can be fired up about that, and we can understand that there are lots of things that we can do to try to change that little graphic. So let me now go to the kinds of things that we can think about. The response that I'm going to describe to you really has 3 steps. But before I talk about them, I want to just spend a minute on asking, what is it that Hoosiers actually think about climate change? So a year ago, IU did a poll and found some sort of surprising results. If you think of Indiana as a state that is thought of as one where people don't, quote unquote, believe in climate change. Of course, it is not a matter of belief. Climate change is a series of facts that are observable and have been observed by thousands of scientists. So it's not really about belief. But in fact, a clear majority of Hoosiers understand that climate change is happening. They support efforts to address the impacts of climate change in our country. And a majority also thinks that climate change is already harming people in the US. We are a couple of weeks away from releasing results of a more comprehensive, broader survey. It's called the Hoosier Life Survey. And it's just so important to know how people think about climate change and how they think about their lives and how they make decisions, that I think that this information will be really helpful to us. Okay, so what are my 3 steps? The first step to being resilient as a state, as a country, and across the globe is to reduce the threat. And what that means is fewer greenhouse gas emissions emitted into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels and other activities like cows burping everywhere. There's 2 ways you can do that. You can emit less, or you can capture more and sequester it in a place where it will not escape into the atmosphere. The more we reduce those emissions getting into the atmosphere, the less disruption we will have and the global population will experience down the road. And if you, I hope, understand from the numbers that I've shown you, that even though if you look at a globe and try to find Indiana on a globe, it's going to be hard to find. But it is not going to be hard to find if you look at it in terms of its contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. An Indiana that is 2 to 4 degrees warmer is going to be a lot better for all of us than an Indiana that's 7 to 10 degrees warmer. And every ton of greenhouse gases that does not go into the atmosphere is going to make it easier for us to stay on the lower end of those projections. So how do we reduce the threat? Well, we can invest in renewable energy, and we are in Indiana, but not nearly enough. We can be more efficient with our energy use through equipment, through buildings, how we build our buildings and how we use our buildings. Lots of opportunity there. And of course, one of the big pluses of energy efficiency is that it also lowers our electric bills and makes our work and home spaces much more comfortable. We can electrify our transportation system. A little car like this, which I think is from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, emits nothing out of the tailpipe. And the amount of pollution that comes from the power plant, because it generated electricity to charge the car in that battery, is less than the car would have emitted otherwise. Plus, it doesn't emit any of the other harmful air pollutants. We can focus on other types of transportation in addition to single-use automobiles. This is a bus. It happens to be an electric bus, so it's a twofer. But we're all finding that there's a lot more walking going on right now and a lot more bike riding and other ways of getting around. These are policies that will make us a cleaner and more energy efficient Indiana. We can look at how we use all these millions of acres of ag land that we have here in Indiana, and how can we use it to not only grow food for the world, but do it in a sustainable way and do it in a way that keeps a lot of that carbon in the ground. And we can become a center point for green and clean technology manufacturing. Let's take advantage of the fact that we're a manufacturing state. This is a picture of Cummins engine, their electric semi-truck. This is a company that for 100 years has been associated with one word, diesel. And Cummins understands that the transportation of the future, even these big workhorse trucks, is going to be electric. They are investing. We should be seeing dozens, hundreds of these kinds of businesses coming to settle in Indiana, where there's a smart, able workforce, where there is a lot of water, where we have steel made, and we are ready to invest in these kinds of industries. Step number 2, we need to avoid increasing the adverse impacts in the future. So here are a couple pretty scary pictures. If you're a mayor of a town and somebody comes to you and says, I'd like permission to build a housing development in this lovely place down by the river, and it's never flooded there before. If you are that mayor, you should be saying, well, what's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? Is it going to be flooding then? And if it is, then maybe we should find another place for your lovely little development. That's a way to use information now to make good choices to avoid impacts and human suffering in the future. And 3, we do need to prepare for the unavoidable. We are already seeing impacts that are adverse to families, to businesses. This is actually one of the biggest parallels to the pandemic situation that we have going on right now. We do need to be prepared. But again, let me make the point that so many of the things we do to be prepared today are also going to help us be more sustainable into the future. If we are resilient, we will turn Indiana into one that's taking proactive steps to reduce the threats and vulnerabilities that are associated with climate change. We will be a state of jobs. We will be a state of trees. We will be a state of happy cows that don't burp so much. We will be a state of growing industries and lots of people chipping in with their ideas and their passion to do this. And I just want to say before I wrap up that there are so many groups in Indiana working on these things right now. The Red Cross, Earth Charter Indiana, Hoosier Environmental Council, Carbon Neutral Indiana, Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, universities across the state, every one of them has programs where students can get engaged, learning about these issues and finding ways to get involved in a very practical, on the ground way. So I hope that you will find a way to direct your concern and passion about this issue into your education and into preparing yourself for once you get out of school. So thank you very much, Sarah, and I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Janet. That was great. Very informative, and some really interesting questions are coming in on the Q&A. And so I want to encourage everybody to post your questions there as you come up with them so you don't forget them, but we will address them towards the end of the webinar. So I want to move on now and think a little bit about how we can fuse facts and feelings to change action. So we're going to hear now from Dr. Shahzeen Attari. Shahzeen is an associate professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington. Her research focuses on people's judgments and decisions about resource use and systems and how to motivate action on climate change. Prior to working at IU, Attari was a postdoctoral fellow at the Earth Institute and the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions at Columbia University. She received her PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering and Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and she goes by Shaz. So Shaz, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me today to talk to everyone about something I'm very passionate about. Today, I'll be talking to you about fusing facts and feelings to motivate action on climate change. But let me start with two huge challenges that we're facing. The first is we really need to stabilize carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere to limit warming. And the second is that we've already started to warm and we need to figure out how to do deep adaptation to figure out how to deal with some of these climate change impacts that are already starting to happen to limit welfare loss. So today I'll be focusing on both of these, but I'll be also switching back and forth between the activist Shaz as well as the researcher Shaz. So to start us off with what is the challenge here today, the challenge is that our emissions have been going up over time. And in order for our emissions to match what we need in order to stabilize concentration, we actually need our emissions to be significantly lowered in order to reach this 1.5 degrees C goal that we have in order to stabilize CO2 concentration so that we limit warming. Now, trying to figure out a very simple heuristic in order to understand this data, you can just imagine that we need our carbon dioxide emissions to go to zero in order to stabilize concentration. So our emissions are pretty high right now, especially for the state of Indiana, and Janet set us up really well for this. In terms of our carbon-based fossil fuels, and this is Indiana's current energy mix by consumption, our carbon-based fossil fuels total to around 94%, whereas our low carbon fuels total to around 7%. So we don't actually have any nuclear, but this number, we actually need to sort of almost reverse these two numbers. So that is a huge task that we have ahead for our state. But what can you do? And this is sort of the activist side of me. I think we all collectively need to do everything in our power to address this huge challenge ahead of us. That means talking to our friends and our neighbors about climate change and why it's important, changing our own behavior in terms of effective actions, and I'll be talking about that in a minute, and also going from being a climate person, where this is an important problem that we have to deal with and reckon with in everything that we do, to sort of thinking about a climate commitment, which is a framework where you ask yourself, all right, I've done this thing, what is the next thing that I can do next? And always try to think about what is the next thing that you can do rather than saying, all right, I've done my part, I've turned off the lights, I'm good. So this is a quote from Mary Annaïse Hegler, and she says, do what you're good at and do your best. And if you're good at making noise, make as much noise as you can. So I wanted to start off the talk talking about that, and then now switch to some more of my research. So ever since I was a researcher as a PhD student, I've been thinking about two separate modes of trying to understand individual behavior and how individual behavior can shape the system. Now, when you think about individual behavior, we actually need two things. it's not that people don't have the right information, it's that they might not have the right information, but they also might not be effectively motivated by the problem. So we need to combine information and motivation in order to effectively motivate action on climate change. In terms of some of my prior research, we have asked participants online, in your opinion, what is the most effective thing you could do to conserve energy in your life? And surprisingly, the #1 response that we've seen is turning off the lights. Now, turning off the lights is great, but it's not a very effective behavior. And unfortunately, this behavior has stuck since the 1980s when Willett Kempton first asked the same question. So behaviors that are easiest to remember and perform, such as turning off the lights when leaving the room, tend to have minimal impacts on climate change. So we need to first move away from this cognitive foothold that turning off the lights has and move towards behaviors that are much more effective when it comes to our individual consumption, change people around us, and then change our state, and then hopefully change the world. And it doesn't have to go in that order. So going back, there are 2 separate types of heuristics that I'd like to talk about today. One is a cultural heuristic, which is what culture tells us is important. And turning off the light is a cultural heuristic. But there are also natural heuristics, which come from thinking and decision-making research. And one of the natural heuristics that I'll be talking about today is anchoring an insufficient adjustment. So if there's a number out there, people will anchor on that number, even if it's irrelevant, and focus on that when they're trying to make estimates when asked. So some of my prior research has looked at how do people perceive how much energy different appliances use in the home. And over here on your y-axis, you have people's perceptions of energy used in watt hours. And on your x-axis, you have actual energy used in watt hours. And what you see here is that a lot of the data lies below the diagonal line, and the diagonal line is where y is equal to x. So some of these actions, and this is how much energy is used by the dishwasher in an hour, are underestimated by orders of magnitude. So the question that we have, especially trying to figure out how to correct these misperceptions, is can we hold onto this curve and pull it up towards the diagonal? Now, one path would be to teach people energy physics and have them do the calculation very basically. But another way of doing this is actually by providing people with expert heuristics in order to replace these cultural heuristics that are really problematic. One expert heuristic that we tested was large appliances that primarily heat and cool things use a lot more energy than people think. So would this change the way people perceive how much energy is used? And we actually find that it does. So imagine that really shallow slope. We're actually able to make it much more steep by using that expert heuristic. So this is the baseline, which was a replication of our prior work. This is how much it improves with the heuristic. And this is how much it improves with giving multiple anchor points along the line. And when you provide both, the curve is the steepest of them all. But what we found is that the heuristic actually also improves downstream behavioral choices. So if I give people 2 behaviors, one is very effective and one isn't, they're much more likely to pick the effective behavior in the heuristic condition than they are in the anchor condition. So our current work is actually trying to look at how can we break apart these faulty heuristics and how can we create and encourage useful heuristics based on expert elicitations that are being conducted and analyzed at the moment by our team. The next piece of, the next paper I'd like to talk to you about just came out 2 weeks ago, and it looks at how do people envision the future energy system in the United States. So we asked participants what they think the current energy mix is and what they hope the future energy mix would be in 2050. And when I use the term energy mix, as I did earlier, I mean energy sources used for electric power, transportation, industry, commercial, and residential. So this is our current energy mix in the United States, and this is the entire United States. And oil is number 1, followed by natural gas and coal, then nuclear, biomass, hydroelectricity, wind, solar, and geothermal. So that's our current energy mix. And here is the data, and I'm going to walk you through it. And this is current and future energy estimates by energy source and political ideology. So what we find is for oil and natural gas, participants underestimate these 2 resources. participants slightly overestimate coal, and they significantly overestimate wind and solar. Now looking at what participants want the future energy mix to look like, and this is some great news. In the future, conservatives and liberals want a really severely decarbonized future. So they want a significant decrease in oil, significant decrease in natural gas and coal, and huge increases in wind and solar energy. So this is great. We all collectively, conservatives and liberals, hope for a decarbonized future energy mix. So this is amazing news. Now we need to figure out how to get there. So the challenging part is we do not agree on the policy pathways to get us to these decarbonized futures. When asked about 6 separate decarbonizing policies and 6 anti-decarbonizing policies, you can see that there are significant differences between conservatives, shown in red, and liberals, shown in blue. So for example, for a carbon tax, liberals much more strongly prefer it than conservatives. There's relatively equal support for nuclear across the board, but in general for the decarbonizing policies, you can see this upward trend where there's a lot more support by liberals than by conservatives. You see the opposite trend for the anti-decarbonizing policies, where in general, there's a lot stronger opposition by liberals than by conservatives for things like relaxing drilling regulations, constructing oil pipelines, investing in new coal plants, so on and so forth. So we need to figure out how to share this vision. Even though we have a shared vision of a future, we need to figure out how to have shared pathways of getting there. When asked what is the most important issue by political ideology across spatial and temporal scales, we asked participants, what is the most important problem in the USA today? For 4 separate problems: climate change, economy and jobs, access to quality healthcare, and immigration. And what we find is that for the United States today, liberals find that climate change and access to quality healthcare are really important problems, whereas much stronger agreement for conservatives for economy and jobs. However, what we find also is that there's an upward trend for climate change, whereas there's a relatively flat trend for all of the 3 other problems. So in general, climate change is a futures problem. This is the world in the future and the US in the future. It's considered to be a futures problem. And it's also considered to be a problem that's faced by other places rather than where we are at. So how do you compress time and space? That is something we're working on in our lab, not the physics side, but more of the psychological side. So stay tuned. So in terms of summarizing this past paper that just came out, the great news is conservatives and liberals want a decarbonized future. There's a significant decrease in fossil fuel use and a significant increase in solar and wind. But the tough news is that there's strong differences between liberals and conservatives in their support for these policies to achieve this future. Now I want to take a step back and situate some of our climate change discussion within the coronavirus pandemic that we're experiencing right now. So Google recently released some mobility data, and this is part of their mobility report where you can play with some of this data at this website. And what we can see is that there's severe downward trends when it comes to things like transit stations, workplace transit, going to the groceries and pharmacy, retail and recreation. And that has actually led to a decrease in emissions right now. But the challenge is this decrease in emissions comes at a huge personal and societal cost. And in general, I do not think that it's going to stick past this pandemic, because the changes that need to be made need to, by design, need to be structural rather than forced upon society in the manner that they are right now in order to save lives. So after COVID, there are 2 paths that we have. Emissions can come roaring back if nations lean heavily on old, dirty energy sources, or strong government support for clean energy could tilt economies in a greener, more climate-friendly direction. And to quote this in a much more feelings method, I want to end my talk today by one of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy. And she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I look forward to engaging with all of your questions, and I'm so excited to be here and be part of this discussion today with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shaz. I do have one question that came in that's a kind of a clarification question that I think is maybe helpful to get an answer to now. Susan asked, could you explain the term heuristic? It might not be familiar to everyone.
Great. I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier. So heuristic means it's a rule for figuring out. So heuristic has the psychological definition and the cultural definition. The psychological definition is the ways we make judgments and decisions based on information that we get in. So when I anchor on irrelevant information and insufficiently adjust my estimates, that is a natural heuristic that our brain uses in order to make psychophysical estimates for numbers. However, cultural heuristics are basically rules that we absorb from our environment, from our social environment, and we use those in order to navigate the decision space that we experience every day. So for example, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, not in use, turn off the juice, so on and so forth. So I sort of separate these two things out as cultural heuristics and natural heuristics that are very hard to break.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. So we want to move on now to hear a little bit about some solutions in action from Stephen and Vernice. I want to introduce you first, Stephen Chybowski. Stephen is a public administration fellow with the City of Fishers, Indiana. And in this role, he leads sustainability initiatives for the City of Fishers. He has a BA in International Relations from Michigan State University and an MPA from Indiana University with a concentration in sustainable development. And presenting with Stephen is Vernice Riego. She is a passionate senior in high school who is helping to craft a climate change resolution for the City of Fishers to ensure her town has a plan to mitigate and adapt to climate change. An active member of Hamilton Southeastern High School's Environmental Club, she has visited multiple schools in Fishers to educate her peers and younger students on sustainability and climate change. After attending a climate leadership training and conference in August of 2019, Riego traveled to Washington, D.C. with the Citizens Climate Lobby to discuss proposed legislation concerning sustainability and climate mitigation to members of Congress. So Stephen and Vernice have some really wonderful experience in action. And so we want to hear from you guys now.
Wonderful, thank you. I will go ahead and share my screen. And first off, I'd just like to say thank you, Sarah, for inviting Vernice and I to speak with you today.
Can you
hear me okay?
Yes, we sure can, Stephen. Go ahead.
Okay, just want to make sure the audio is coming through correctly.
You're great.
Wonderful. All right, so first off, Sarah, thank you for inviting Vernice and I to speak on this webinar with you. We're delighted to be here. And Vernice and I would like to talk about implementing some solutions to help us address climate change in our local communities. So Vernice and I both have been collaborating here in the community of Fishers, and we'll talk about some of the things that we've been working on.
Definitely.
So as a little bit of background, my current role with the City of Fishers, I'm a public administration fellow there with the city. So that is a new position for the city where I'm kind of a project manager for the mayor's office. We here in the City of Fishers, we do not currently have a full-time office or position dedicated to sustainability, but that does not mean that we are not finding ways to address climate change here in our community. And as for some other characteristics about the city, we are a fast-growing suburban community on the northern border of Indianapolis. We currently have a population of about 100,000. And yeah, we've been doing everything we can in the past year to address climate change. So here on this slide, I'd like to go through some of the things that we have been working on here in Fishers. I would like to begin. One thing that we started with is we've been researching renewable energy options to help offset our energy use with our municipal operations. So to get that process started, we started looking at what renewable energy options would be feasible, both technically and financially in our community. We've also then reached out to the renewable energy contractors, had them come out and evaluate some of our properties and help us decide which locations would be best for renewable energy. So we are moving forward with that progress, and you know, some things have been slightly delayed due to this current coronavirus, but we are hoping to get back on track with some of these projects once business returns to usual. Another great thing that we have been doing here in the City of Fishers is we have been participating in the Environmental Resilience Institute's resilience cohorts. And these are great resources that are offered to communities in the state of Indiana. We are big fans of this. Last year in this resilience cohort, they helped guide us through completing our community's first greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And this year they're helping guide us through creating our first climate action plan. And so that would be a municipal plan that sets goals and actions for us to move forward in addressing and reducing our impacts on the environment. Another great resource that Environmental Resilience Institute offers to communities here in Indiana that we've taken advantage of and would highly recommend is their Resilience Index. And this is kind of a self-assessment to help communities get an idea of how prepared they are to handle shocks and stressors such as flooding or extreme heat. So that's a self-assessment, and we were able to get all the different city departments involved and discuss, you know, how well prepared we are for these types of events. Another activity that we have going on here in Fishers is that we are adding hybrid vehicles to our police fleet for the first time this year. And from that, started some research into how we can further adopt additional hybrid vehicles in the future and hopefully transition to all electric vehicles at some point in the future. So we've conducted some research on vehicle options out there and where the technology is going, and some of the questions and concerns regarding the supply chain with that. And one other exciting project that we've been working on for this year, and I'm going to ask that Vernice help me talk about her process with this, is we've been working and collaborating on a youth-led climate resolution that's been led by Vernice. And so that will hopefully set some long-term goals and actions for us in addressing climate and sustainability. And Vernice, would you be willing to share a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so I started this process of drafting and then passing the climate change resolution for the city around August, so around 8 months ago. I actually reached out to Jim Poyser. He's the executive director for Earth Charter in Indiana, and he got me connected with Steven through City Hall, and we had a meeting talking about what can we do in the city of Fishers to help mitigate climate change and implement more sustainability objectives. So I proposed passing a climate change resolution, and with that came a lot of research, time, and work outside of school. I had meetings with some officials, heads of departments, and I met with some city council members, and I'm still in the process of doing that, but of course COVID-19 has, you know, put a barrier on that process, and hopefully after COVID-19 and business as usual, I'll be able to present in front of the mayor and his team and hopefully get a decision on passing that resolution. But basically, I have like 4 main goals in the resolution. So one is acknowledging that climate change is a real thing and our city needs to address it. And then 2 is to act in accordance to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change's like advised 2 degrees Celsius target. And so to do that, we'd have a carbon emission reduction goal for certain years. And then we're gonna be evaluating a tree canopy. So that's the second goal. The third is creating a climate action plan. It's kind of the thing after a climate change resolution. So it's kind of like it envisions past a climate change resolution. And then the fourth goal is creating a department of sustainability and environmental resilience, because right now we don't have any certain group or committee. Actually, no, we changed it to a committee, not a department, but we don't have a certain group selected to talk about or address climate change or anything environmental in the city of Fishers. So as a growing city, we really do need that. There's a necessity for it. It's really big goals for a city, but it is needed. So that's why I'm here to advocate for it. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Vernice. Thank you, Vernice. And just one last thing that I wanted to share with you all before I pass it over to Vernice so she could talk about her activities is to show the results of our community's greenhouse gas emissions here in Fishers. So looking at this chart, you can see our community emissions that we put out in 2015 and in 2018. So we did 2 years so we could start establishing a trend and see how things are changing here in our community. So in 2015, our total emissions here in the community of Fishers was about 1.25 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. In 2018, it appears that we've increased to about 1.26 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So we did increase over that 3-year period. But it's important to note that in that 3-year period, we had a 5% increase in population, and the emissions only increased by about 1%. So we are starting to reduce our per capita emissions here in the community. So that is a positive trend that we want to see continuing. And when you look at this chart here, you can see that the blue section, that is our residential energy, and that is our largest section of emissions in this community. And the second largest section there is the yellow bar, and that is our transportation emissions. And that, that fits the characteristics of our community as a suburban community just outside of Indianapolis. We would expect to see those two as the largest sectors of emissions. And overall, I would say that our total emissions are about on par with other communities of our size around the country. So we're just kind of right in the middle with other communities of this size. And that is the last slide that I have, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of this if anybody has, but I'm going to pass it over to Vernice so that she could talk a little bit more about her actions in the community.
Okay, so hi, I'm a high school student. Well, I was a senior, but I didn't really start this activism until around this time last year. I remember coming home from school, sitting down at the couch, scrolling through YouTube on my phone, and I stumbled upon this video titled School Strike for Climate. And it was a TED Talk by Greta Thunberg. And she moved me to tears because I never truly realized the severity of the situation of climate change for our generation. Because I was just a high school student trying to keep a good physics grade. So I and many kids, teenagers, millennials, adults have been inspired by this one girl that put our future into perspective. So I sat there on the couch for around 20 minutes wondering what a 17-year-old can do about a global crisis. So I did what any person of any age would do. I Googled it. I looked up, what can I do about climate change? And one of the links that popped up was a conference called the Climate Reality Project. So right then and there, I booked a plane ticket to Minnesota where the conference was being held and went to attend the conference. So after attending that conference, my confidence about speaking about climate change and taking action rose. I sat through different panel discussions and I took all these notes, listened to Al Gore speak for 2 hours and learned a lot. And there at the conference, I networked with a lot of people around the country, and networking is just very important when it comes to any kind of activism. And through networking, I met Jim Poyser, as I said, the executive director of Earth Charter Indiana. And through him, he gave me all these opportunities to speak at fundraisers, schools, and even IU's Youth Climate Summit. And at those opportunities, I met people, and everything just kind of branched out where I got to speak at other events. And I'm just saying here, I'm not a good public speaker. I have really bad stage fright, but I pushed through it. But in no means do you have to be talented in writing or public speaking to talk about the subject of your future and expressing your concerns. Even with any subject, you don't need to be talented. You just need to have a voice and make sure you're passionate about what you're speaking about. And that's just for public speaking. And in no way you have to put yourself at the podium if you want to do something about climate change. So public speaking is a big thing for people if they want to do something about climate change. But if you don't, there are other options out there. So besides public speaking, I had opportunities to go behind closed doors to all levels of government, as I talked about with the climate change resolution on the local level. But on the national level, I got the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. to lobby. Well, lobbying is basically a form of advocacy where you intend to influence like political decisions in an issue, and you talk to members of Congress about your view and why it matters in the decision. So the main goal for me there in Washington, D.C. was to help for them to end up supporting and co-sponsoring these environmental bills I propose that they support. But thankfully, Susan Brooks, my district's House representative, ended up co-sponsoring an environmental bill, which is a big thing because she doesn't really respond to any bill pertaining to climate change. So I sat through these meetings in Washington, D.C., lobbied, and learned a lot about the government process. And from there, from the national level, I got to speak to others on the state level. I spoke at a press conference at the State House about my views on climate change through a member of the youth's perspective. And I testified in front of the Environmental Affairs Committee at the State House for Kerry Hamilton's state climate change resolution. And I lobbied at the State House, spoke to my representatives, which would be like Senator Merritt. I talked to him about a bill concerning coal. And lastly, on the local level, yeah, I talked about passing a climate change resolution with all these goals. But that's basically what I've been doing on the government level. But if you want to know more about the climate change resolution, I'm sure I'll have my information distributed, or you'll have access to my email. But some of you guys already probably have a resolution in your city, and you may be wondering, oh, what can I do without having to take a whole chunk of time out of my day and life to dedicate it to climate change? And that's why I'm here. So some examples of what you can do as a college student, as a high school student. It won't take much of your time, but one is to like organize a strike. I know with COVID-19 going on, it's going to be kind of hard too, but once it's over, maybe you could consider organizing a strike at your school, or like as an organization, a club, or just your college. I'm not good with organizing events, but I do know there are resources out there. There are organizations out there to help you, guide you through organizing a strike, getting like a whole crowd involved, and Earth Charter Indiana is one of them. Will definitely help you. Should definitely reach out if you consider doing a strike. And I know that Indianapolis has a strike every now and then. If you want to go speak at the podium, I know there's an open podium, and then you could start public speaking about it and raising awareness. It's all about raising awareness. So You could also organize a club at your school to implement a recycling program or implement composting, or just a club to brainstorm ideas to raise more awareness through your community. Because just community activities, raising awareness in your community, it's probably the most important thing, because collectively all these communities that like raise awareness like individually, they all come together collectively, and it's a powerful message. It does a lot. But you can organize a club, yes, or if you're not confident enough to start doing all these things and you just want to learn more, definitely attend a climate summit. You learn a lot from it. You get very inspired. Or you could attend a climate reality conference, which is the one I went to with Al Gore. I know there's one upcoming in the fall in Michigan, but you learn a lot, you network, you definitely get inspired. And if you don't want to attend a conference, you could always just contact your city government. Just talk to your city about sustainability. See what they can do. Just learning about what your city's doing right now and asking them, hey, can I help in any way? Even though, I'm a high school student, can I help in any way? I never thought I'd be drafting a resolution, but if I never took the step to contact a city official, I would never have gotten this opportunity. So definitely talk to your city. You could also lobby, like I said. You could do it through Citizens Climate Lobby. There's a bunch of chapters all over Indiana. And or you could lobby individually. You could just contact your senator, your representative, just have a meeting with them, talk about your concerns. But if you're still lost after those suggestions, you can always contact Earth Charter Indiana, which is an amazing organization. So definitely check them out if you're still lost. And that's about it.
Well, thank you so much, Steve and Vernice. You are both truly inspirational people. Steve, you've done all that work in only a year. It's amazing, and those comments have been coming in on the Q&A. That work is amazing. And Vernice, you are actually a wonderful public speaker, as evidenced today, and your work is really inspirational. Thank you so much for what you've been doing. So I want to turn now to engage all of our presenters with questions that have been coming in from participants. We have nearly 90 participants logged in, so a lot of great questions have been coming in. And I think just for, it's serious, but it's also fun. Let's start with a fun question. This is for Janet from Sadie, who asks, when you say cows that burp less, do you mean we should have less cattle, or should we be feeding them something different? Or is there a less gassy breed?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I am not an agricultural expert, but I do understand that there's research underway about how actually to change cattle feed in ways that will make them less gassy. I wasn't necessarily saying that we should have fewer cows, but I will say also that one really effective way to reduce your own carbon footprint is to eat less meat. It doesn't mean you have to eat no meat, but you could just try skipping meat 1 or 2 meals a week, and that right there would make a difference.
Thanks, Janet. To a more serious question that really can be for any of the presenters, Susan wants to know, how do you think our national and global experience with the coronavirus will affect our response to climate change? And Shahzeen touched on this a little bit, so she may want to start.
Sure. So there are a couple of points. I think first, because we've not been traveling as much and we've been ordered to shelter in place, that actually means our global emissions are down. So what that means for our 2020 emissions, they might necessarily be flat or they might have increased slightly, but we don't expect it to have increased a lot this year. That said, there's also been, I'm sheltering in place right now in my home, and there's also been a huge change in psychology. And the question that I have for all of us is, how do we make sure that we retain our empathy, both for ourselves and people around us, in order to deal with the climate change problem, rather than feeling so exhausted from dealing with coronavirus? Because I feel really exhausted from dealing with coronavirus, so that we re-channel our efforts and not forget about climate change while we're dealing with this pandemic. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that Kendra Louise Pierre, a New York Times reporter, had this amazing article in the New York Times saying how climate change is a threat multiplier. And we don't usually think about threat multiplication. And let me just explain what she meant. So for example, if COVID affects firefighters and if we have extreme wildfires, how we don't have a response team ready in order to deal with the wildfires that are taking place. So that actually, because we're already experiencing climate change, any threats that actually come on board can sort of hurt our ability to deal with these new risks. So we really need to address climate change, but our own research shows that it's always thought of as a futures problem or as a problem that affects other people. So we really need to start those conversations, start the behavior change ourselves, and start constantly becoming and talking about climate change with whoever we can. I do it with my conservative neighbor whenever he comes by to ask me if I'm alive or not, because again, I live alone in the woods, so he checks in on me all the time. So I think those conversations are really hard because we disagree on a lot, but I think it's a start.
I'm worried that people are going to be so ready to just get back to the life that they remember, and that our economy, this is not acceptable, what's going on right now, and people need to get back to work, and our lives do need to get back to more normal. So how do we keep that sense of empathy, remember these lessons that we're learning about how to be prepared, how to act when it's not an emergency, to try to prevent a future emergency? And that, I think, is one of the key parallels between what we're dealing with now and with climate change. I think if there's any lesson that this virus is teaching us, it is that humans affect the environment and the environment affects humans. And we cannot keep it away. We can't keep a virus away. We can't keep floodwaters away. We can't keep a heat wave away. Although we can mitigate the severity of those latter things by emitting fewer greenhouse gases. So I hope that this has been traumatic enough for the country that there will be conversations about thinking more in a future scenario and thinking more broadly about how everybody in the country can be affected. That's another lesson, I think, from this virus, is that it's affecting everybody, cities, suburbs, rural areas, red states, blue states, coastal states, interior states. And it brings us together a little bit as a country.
I also wanted to add one more point to what Janet was saying, is that this has also made me realize that if we're all in agreement, for the most part, that we can collectively come together and act in a way that's pretty powerful. Like, imagine the entire country of India has a shelter in place for 21 days. The United States, with the stimulus bill that they just passed, imagine if we could use, think about what that would mean if we could activate in that manner on climate change. But there are also lots of differences between coronavirus and climate change, which don't allow us to just use those examples and just quickly apply them to climate change. Anyways, just some thoughts on that.
I'll jump in and ask Stephen if he has any thoughts about that question from the perspective of city government and someone who's focused on sustainability within the city. Stephen, do you think that coronavirus will help a city like Fishers be more prepared for issues that are more perhaps directly or more obviously climate change issues?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, sorry, Stephen. I'm just interested in your perspective about how coronavirus may help a city government be more prepared for climate change issues. Do you think it will help us be more resilient within city governments?
Yeah, I think this coronavirus situation really gives us an opportunity to see where our communities stand in regards to resiliency. I mean, completing that resilience index that we did earlier this year, allowed us to assess how well prepared we are to respond to certain kinds of shocks and stressors, such as a pandemic like this. Lets us see what our food supply looks like, even whether it's local or coming from farther away, that kind of thing, right? So we've done that evaluation internally, right? Thought about those questions, and now with this rather tragic situation upon us right now, we can kind of actually see where it is that we're well prepared and where it is we may want to take further action. So I think as long as municipal governments are paying attention and evaluating what they need to do, I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn and improve for future events.
Thanks, Steve. Vernice, a question came in thanking you for presenting and for all the work that you've done so far. And the question is, at which level of government did you feel like you had the most impact and why?
Okay, I was looking at that question. What did I think? I feel like the local level, it's just being in the community and knowing a lot of the people personally and all those groups, students, kids. I'm able to actually like look at them and think, I'm helping you in some way and contributing to a part of your future. And just because I visit schools and talk to the children, and they're just so lively, and I don't know, it hits me close. So I work harder on the local level to get things going with activism, because I don't know, seeing the kids' faces hits me.
That's great. That's great. I'll stay with you for a minute. Another question was about tips for high schoolers to take initiative, to get effective information and support from other students and members of their community. You talked a little bit about this, but maybe you could say more.
Yeah, so as I said, go to Earth Charter and those other websites I was talking about, but I think it's also important to be informed about the actual issue about climate change, most importantly also in Indiana. So look at the Purdue Climate Change Research Center's page, and maybe go to ERIT, the Resilience Index, and just look at those websites. And for building up, a crowd in your community, it's kind of tough when people are hesitant to believe that climate change is a real thing, or it won't hit them. As you said, a lot of people think it's a future problem, but building a crowd up it's just, you have to start with like a club, an organization, maybe start with a chapter, maybe a citizens climate lobby. There are a lot of other chapters like Elders Climate Action, I think that's another organization. But you go to those meetings, you learn more about that. And as I said, networking is a big thing, and building up a crowd and all this support, just raising awareness through them. That's just how I did it. And if you don't have a club at your school, I recommend you make one, because there are a lot of people out there that feel the same way you do.
That's great. Good advice. Andrea asks Shahzeen, can you give an example of an expert heuristic that appears to actually work?
So one that I talked about in our paper, in our presentation, which has been published in the journal Nature Energy, is the following. Large appliances that heat and cool use a lot more energy than people think. So you can think about things like air conditioners, washing machines, dishwashers, dryers. They tend to use a lot more energy than people think. So when we provide people with that expert heuristic, that actually helps push up their perceptions that were earlier very, very shallow. So it gets closer to the y is equal to x line where perceptions match reality. And Joe Kattenbacker in our lab is actually has finished interviewing 30 different energy experts across the nation. And he is in the process of creating an entire library of heuristics. So stay tuned.
That's exciting. Shahzeen, another question that came in for you is, why is it that conservatives ranked as neutral in most types of policies for decarbonization? Does it imply some level of opposition to any kind of policy, not just climate policy?
Right. So this is a puzzle that I haven't figured out how to quite crack. When it comes to even response to the coronavirus, there are huge differences in conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, of whether they trust news sources, whether they are willing to shelter in place, ... So there are lots of hypotheses out there. One is party over policy. So I vote as my party rather than actually evaluating the policy. But the good news is, and there was just a paper 2 days ago that was published in Nature Climate Change by Hank Jenkins Smith et al. And they looked at the entire state of Oklahoma. And what they found is that liberals and Democrats hold their views about climate change very, very strongly. But conservatives and Republicans hold their views about climate change in a much more unstable manner so that they can actually be moved based on the intervention or based on the particular politician that they're listening to. So what this means is that if we have interventions, we can actually use them in order to better effectively communicate the risks of climate change. But there are lots of other contentious issues where we are seeing a lot of partisanship. And let me just end it on this one example. So the partisanship even comes up with who you want your kid to marry. So there are studies that show parents who are liberal or conservative do not want their children to marry people from the opposite party. And so this partisanship is starting to percolate into almost all factors of our lives. So much so that this tribalism is really challenging, and I don't quite know how to break it apart. So if you have ideas, please, please, please email me. I'm really easy to find, just Shaz and Indiana. You'll find me in Google.
Thanks. I think this is a question for any of the panelists who have thoughts about it, but what's the best advice that you can offer for current students? We have a lot of college students watching and a lot of high school students watching that will soon be going into the workforce to encourage sustainable development through their new careers. Stephen, you might have a perspective on it from your experience.
Yeah, I can start on that topic. My first thought here in that is looking at the top 2 predicted fastest growing jobs in the country for the next 10 years. And this is from the federal government's data. They're saying that wind turbine technicians and solar panel installers are going to be the two fastest growing jobs in the country for the next 10 years. So for those that are interested in that type of work, I mean, that right there is a great opportunity and a great sign, and something that's very promising and encouraging. And yeah, I see this as a very emerging field and an exciting time to get involved in this type of work in our generation. So I think students coming out of school today are going to be in a good position to get to work on this subject.
Sarah, I would just add, as somebody on the other end of the career path, and I grew up in a time where the job market was really different and the student debt situation was really different. I recognize that. But I think a useful and timeless lesson is that opportunities come along, and you never know what opportunities might come along. And that I didn't think I was going to go into environmental law. I trained as a lawyer, and it just happened that was the job I got, and it turned into this amazing career. But I helped it be an amazing career because of the way I interacted with people and the friends that I made along the way. And I would encourage you, whether you are studying engineering or law or chemistry or biology or English, or you want to be a teacher, there's just whatever it is you want to do, you can intersect with this issue in a professional way if you want to do it. And there are so many organizations that provide opportunities for students to get practical experience and to meet people in the field. You may just have to be persistent at it, and the first job that you get may not be your dream climate job. But if you really want to work in this field, I'm quite certain that you can find a way to do it.
Thanks for that perspective, Janet. I think I want to wrap up with one question here that is, I'm kind of modifying somebody's question that was specifically to Shaz. She said, I love your interview on the Water Values podcast. You're very active in a variety of media, podcasts, mainstream news, social media. What do you think has been the most impactful form of communication and why? And I would actually, Shaz, after you answer that question, I think that other presenters may have a perspective on that too, because all of you are communicators in some way in the work that you're doing.
I think that's a hard question. So let me go super philosophical here. And sort of relating this also to the previous question, I think we're going to have jobs on climate change regardless of where we end up on the emissions curve, where we end up with concentration, whether it's on mitigation and adaptation, dealing with the risks, trying to assess the risks. I mean, this is a sort of a train that's headed towards us. Regardless of what happens in the world, we are going to have to reckon with this train. That said, I actually have been challenging myself to become more active in being an activist as well as a researcher. And in general, in academia, there tends to be a deep hesitation to being an activist or an activist researcher, because there has been this old view, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, where activism can discolor or augment the research quality that is done. And I actually vehemently disagree with that. I've been working on climate change since the year 2004. I eat, breathe, and sleep this stuff. So why the hell wouldn't I want to be an activist on it? That just doesn't make sense to me. So that's my path. I will actually talk to anyone who will listen, including my conservative neighbor, but sometimes we start yelling at each other. And then we probably need to stop at that point. And we do stop, and then we go for a hike, and then we start yelling at each other again. And we disagree on everything from gun laws to whether President Trump is doing a good job on dealing with the pandemic, which was our conversation earlier today. So I think communicating with anyone who will listen is a good start. And then picking your mode of communication that adheres to your personality is also a good start. Like I go after Vernice because she loves kids and she's able to go in front of school kids and talk to them. I don't know if I could do that because I just want to sit down and play with them and they'd probably give me lots of hope. And then I just, you know, not want to talk about climate change. So I think figuring out your voice in whatever means is you're able, whether it's writing, music, poetry, storytelling, data visualization, you name it, do it.
Thanks. Any other presenters have thoughts on the best form of communication?
Yeah, I want to weigh in because like Shaz, sometimes I feel like the only people, I get interviewed and I tweet a little bit and I go on podcasts and stuff. Sometimes I feel like the only people I'm talking to are people who already get it, and that I don't need to convince them of anything. Although I think all of us need to be encouraged and inspired and motivated to do more than we're doing already. But I got to hear the really incredible climate scientist, Katharine Hayhoe, who's from Texas Tech University and is an evangelical Christian, and she's very clear about that, and that's the culture that she comes from. She's a very compelling speaker. She's absolutely a scientist, and she doesn't have any problem reconciling her faith with her understanding of how the climate is changing. And she talks about communication a lot and says that the most important thing that we can do is talk to one another. But then she looked out on this audience of academics who already were working in the climate field, and she said, well, but mostly not you guys, because you just aren't going to be effective with Shaz's neighbor or with your Uncle Fred, who you disagree with about everything. So that was kind of discouraging. But then she gave another piece of advice, which is start with something that you have in common with somebody. You have grandchildren? Well, I have grandchildren. There's a lot to talk about there. You're a bird watcher? Well, I am too. Have you noticed that the robins are actually coming earlier than they used to? Why is that? I grow tomatoes. You grow tomatoes. Did you have to water yours a lot last summer? Because I sure did, and they weren't as good. And you try to, because we're all people, we all basically want the same things, which is a safe, healthy community for our kids to grow up and not have to be worried about bills and that sort of thing. And a lot of the stuff that divides us really is kind of on the fringes of what matters to most of us, and that you have very small groups of people making huge amounts of noise about very divisive issues. So I would encourage you to not be discouraged the way I have been. And if you have the opportunity to interact with people, don't come at it from liberal conservative or climate believer or climate denier, but just a person who lives in the world and sees what's happening and cares that my kid who has asthma be able to actually go out and play baseball with his or her friends. And that would be a better world than the one we have right now. Well, let's talk about what we need to do to get there.
That's very wise, Janet. Well, I want to pause here.
I'm old and wise.
On that, I want to pause here and ask the participants to please take a moment, and we're going to ask you to answer those same poll questions that we asked at the beginning. They should pop up on your screen, and we'll look at the results in just a minute after the poll closes. But as you complete the poll, I want to take this time to thank our presenters. Amazing talks this evening. The work by Stephen and Vernice is so inspirational. Thank you guys so much for that and for taking the time to talk to us about it. And we heard such critical information from Janet and Shaz. So much of this from Shaz's own research, which is so compelling and helpful. And from Janet's work that is so practical and useful for our communities as we're trying to become more resilient in the face of climate change. Thank you so much also to the technical support that we've had during the webinar. Steve and Chris are a couple of our technical folks here at Indiana University, and your help was tremendous. And thank you so much to you, wonderful participants who have been online and stuck with us through this. You've made some wonderful comments and asked some great questions throughout. And of course, we've only been able to get to some of those live, and we've been able to have some nice discussion around some of those live. But we also have tried to answer a lot of those in the Q&A back to the person who has asked the question. And we want to try to make those questions and comments available on our website. Again, that's environment.indiana.edu. That's also the place that you're going to be able to find a recording of the webinar in the coming days. And so I think that we have the poll results showing up. Can everybody else see those poll results for, let's see, I think Chris is going to share. So this is the comparison from the beginning of the webinar to now. It looks like we have some more very confident people in how you can make an impact to help solve climate issues by 2030 for your community. And that's exciting to see. And then it looks like we all have, you know, pretty much the same feelings about there is a lot of ability to have an effective impact at different levels of government to mitigate climate change. So that's exciting. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Chris showed his screen for us to see that, so thank you. I want to remind you all that we're also going to post resources on the website. There were several wonderful organizations that were cited throughout the webinar, and we will post the URLs to those on the website as well. And I want to also point out that there's been a lot of effort to say to young people, and not just young people, everyone, that civic engagement is really important for all of us at this time if we want to try to solve climate. And so take some time to consider how you can do that. And for young people, I think you can better do that when you are educated. And so take some time to consider if you're trying to make some college decisions in the near future, look across the state of Indiana and stay here and be a part of making a difference here in our state by continuing your education here. Indiana University Bloomington is just one place where there are multiple programs that address the environment and sustainability. And we want to talk to you if you're interested in learning more about those. So thank you guys for your participation tonight. Just as we have all adjusted our lives so drastically recently and are beginning to see that collective effort of doing that toward a goal to flatten the curve, I know that you each can be a part of the same kind of collective effort for climate solutions. Our coordinated individual efforts can make rapid change when we need it to. And 2030 is not far off, and it's not impossible. So we hope you feel inspired towards this goal. Thank you very much for participating. Be safe and stay well, and keep working toward climate solutions in Indiana. Thanks, everyone.